Are you looking for expert advice on how to lay a floor and how to soundproof it? Well, I interviewed Jeffrey Meltzer, who has been working in the floor industry ever since 1994, and he became a certified floor inspector in 2005. Now, I interviewed Jeffrey through Skype from Stockholm while he was in Los Angeles, and I apologize for the video quality, but the interview itself contains some really valuable information and tips that you should be aware of when you're starting out. So without further ado, let's jump right into the interview.
So, Jeff, could you do me a favor and tell me a little bit about yourself and where you work and a little bit about your job?
Right. So I have been a NWFA inspector for about 20 years, since 2005, when they created the NWFA certification. And during that time, a number of the inspections that I had done for attorneys, for homeowners, have involved sound abatement. And it's one of those issues and one of those challenges that I have found in connection with flooring, specifically with wood flooring, in multifamily residences. And it seems to be a challenge and something that's commonly misunderstood in the flooring industry.
Well, to starters, I literally before this conversation, I didn't know your job existed, to be honest. So, could you tell me could you tell me about the basics? What is the purpose? What do you do during a normal day at work?
Well, let me preface that by saying that in the construction industry, when you're constructing a home or an apartment building or anything, that most trades are inspected by either city inspectors or so forth. The wood flooring industry is one of the unique trades where there is no such thing as an inspector from the city. So if you pull a building permit, they will verify that the electrical is done correctly, that the structure is constructed correctly. The only sector or the only division that they don't check for and they don't have inspectors for is wood flooring. And that's why my designation and my practice actually exists, because you can't call the city to do a wood flooring inspection.
Well, Jeff, most of the people who are going to listen to this, they're going to probably create their own villa or make by themselves, lay out a floor. And I was wondering, what are the top three things that you need that you would advise them to do when they're trying to put everything up? Let's start at the buying part. Before they plan everything out, what should they think about?
Number one, this is the message, and I'm glad that you've even created this kind of content for people. The number one message, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough, the number one message is that the advertising and the numbers that are put out throughout the industry talk about laboratory conditions when they're talking about sound abatement. And what happens in a laboratory has very little to do with what happens in reality. And let me give you an example. In sound abatement, they have something called IIC and SDC. And those are sound abatement numbers that are generated and basically parameters or numbers that sound abatement can generate, sound abatement materials can generate. Those numbers, typically done in a laboratory, don't translate directly to what happens in your home. And as the old saying goes, your mileage may vary. The same thing happens with sound abatement. Your sound abatement numbers will vary. And a lot of it depends upon how your home was constructed. So for instance, if your house is designed with lightweight concrete, and that's very common here in the United States, where they put a plywood subflooring, especially in a wood frame construction, they put 2 inches of lightweight concrete on top, I don't know of a lot of the manufacturers that even test for that. And the reason being is that type of construction is very hard to mitigate the sound. And so a lot of times what they'll do is they'll test for 6-inch concrete, and that has no relationship to a 2-inch lightweight concrete. It's apples and oranges. And it's that confusion that causes people to use or misdiagnose and prescribe the type of sound abatement materials, and they don't realize that until the neighbor below complains or they get a litigation notice from somebody who's complaining about the sound. So that's the one thing that needs to be resolved. I'm sorry.
Okay, so that's great. So don't trust the advertisements 100% because it was tested. Everything was tested in a lab. So are there any like tried and true things you can give regarding like advice when somebody's shopping for, let's say, soundproof flooring?
Okay, so soundproof flooring, the flooring doesn't have any sound abatement characteristics at all by itself. So now we're only talking about the sound abatement materials, either cork or rubber or foam. There's dozens of type of sound abatement materials, and then you have the structure itself. What I would say, I'm going to put this into a very good analogy. If we want to know the health of a patient, we have to take his temperature, we have to take his blood pressure. And until you know those numbers, you can't prescribe anything. So if we're talking about sound abatement as a prescription or a solution for a problem, you have to take the temperature of the patient, right?
Uh-huh.
You following what I'm saying there?
So what I think you're trying to say is that you need to know the context of the floor. You need to know in which building it is, and you also need to know in what the surrounding area of the floor that you're going to lay before you actually decide this is the one that fits. Is that what you're trying to say?
Exactly. My analogy maybe was a little rough, but what I'm saying is, yes, you have to assess your situation. You have to find out what your baseline is.
Uh-huh.
And then you can go and look and see and determine what type of sound abatement you need once you understand, because every structure is different. Every home is different. I did an inspection in Los Angeles area here one time, and we couldn't figure out why this flooring structure was performing so dismally slow. And what we did is we used invasive cameras, basically a endoscopy type of camera or a borescope camera, and we took the camera and we put it into the structure of the building, and we were able to determine that when the building was actually constructed 40 years ago, they didn't put any insulation in the joists. And if you can imagine, it was like a drum, with a top material and a bottom material, and the sound was bouncing back and forth. And it was that lack of just the basic insulation that was causing this home to perform so poorly.
So what you're saying is that, let's say, this apartment, for example, I live in a one-room apartment, right? And it's basically 4 walls, right? And it's just, when I moved in here, it was just perfect echo until I hung things like this on the walls. The point is that it sounds like, since there was nothing in between the walls, the inside of the floors, it was just bouncing around, and it was just
correct.
Nothing else. I see. Okay.
So let me give you one more analogy, okay?
Go for it.
The room that you're in right now, look directly up.
Yeah.
That ceiling, if above that ceiling, above the drywall, there was no insulation between you and the person that lived above you. You would have, every time that person walked around, you would hear his footsteps. And depending upon how the home was constructed, you may be really upset or very satisfied. It just depends. And you looking up, you can't tell what the construction is. And so that's the problem. You have no idea what was done when the home was built because you weren't there.
Okay, so I get you. Well, My first reaction, because I'm living on the 8th floor, and I know that I can. The only thing basically hear nothing from my near neighbors. I know it's because there's a lot of like thick concrete, and there's a concrete floor, but the thing that I'm standing on is wood. So I guess there's concrete and there's some wood on it. Correct?
There's more than likely, if you know there's concrete, it depends on if it's 8 floors, typically it's what's called, it would be 3,000 PSI concrete slab, not lightweight concrete. So there is a difference. And the
I don't
idea
know
is,
anything. I'm sorry, Jeff. I don't know the basic terminologies. Could you explain to me and the people who haven't heard what that means? Could you explain what that is? Is that normal? 3,000 PSI, you said?
yeah. So typically when you're talking about tall buildings, over 3 stories, they're going to build it with heavy duty concrete, reinforced concrete, which is basically structural grade concrete.
Right.
And that is 6-inch or 8-inch thick. Those obviously give you a tremendous amount of sound abatement just naturally. And when laboratories are testing, a lot of times that's what they test them with, is a 6-inch concrete slab. In California, a lot of these buildings were built in the 1970s and 80s, and they're only 3 stories high. And so the construction is different. And so that's where you have to know your situation. It goes back to our initial conversation, which is you have to assess your situation.
Okay, so I understand that it's really depends on the situation that you are in. But if there are any advice that a person could look for, like they decide that they're going to go to a store where they're going to buy the material, what should they look out for? What is good material and what is
Yeah, I would say that in order, and there was a video that I created with an attorney in the construction defect and basically real estate attorney, and it would be intelligent and cautious and prudent for anybody before they do any installation and any sound abatement, just to make sure that they're doing it correctly. And I would suggest that they seek the advice of a sound abatement expert and not go by the laboratory numbers. I've seen numbers that were basically not even credible. And it's hard to get the actual numbers because a lot of people just publish them, and there's no basis for reality with those. And I'm just being frank and honest with you. Yeah.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. What I'm trying to pull out is kind of the concrete tips. But the more I listen to you, the more I understand that would be hard. Well,
I'll give you one bit of tip that a good takeaway, and this is something that I learned from a sound abatement engineer. And there are people that are engineers in sound abatement. I work with a gentleman, Dr. Hale. He's got a PhD in sound sciences. And what he indicated to me is that one material of a certain thickness is not as good as 2 dissimilar materials, which would be the same thickness. In other words, differential materials deal with differential frequencies. And so let's say if you use cork and rubber has one frequency abatement, cork has a different one. And so by using dissimilar materials, you cover a wider spectrum of sound spectrums or sound waves.
So what you're saying is you should technically lay 2 floors, or at least
materials. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's just 2 materials on top of each other. All right. And
yes.
And I assume there are many these kind of materials put together that you can easily find and buy in warehouse stores and so on, right?
Yes, and certain materials have what's called a better delta, which is the amount of sound abatement characteristics that material will give you. And some of them, like I said, are really of no value. And what I have seen in my years of experience, and this is probably a good takeaway, is the marketing and the numbers that they advertise sometimes have no relevance to what they actually produce. And that's unfortunate, but that is the case.
Okay, so let's see. So other than that, but let's say that I don't want to go to a specialist. I believe in myself. I have a villa, and I'm gonna show my girlfriend how handy I am with my hands, right? And like I'm gonna build everything on my own. Nothing will go wrong. Then,
Yeah.
oh, and I have a standard villa where it was built in like 20 years ago, and everything is pretty much in great shape. I want to have a wooden floor that goes really nice with some old-timey furniture, right? And that's it. I don't have any pre-knowledge. What except from the advice, don't do it.
Well, let me tell you some of the things you should look at before you. So it's kind of like if you wanted to go sailing from Sweden to the UK.
Yeah.
I don't know what ocean that is. What sea that is? The North Sea, I guess it is.
Yeah, and Atlantic, but yeah.
Yeah, the Atlantic. Okay, so you just get in your sailboat and you start sailing, and you're going into to very difficult waters, and you may want to prove to your girlfriend how handy you are, but you might die, and so you want to be cautious, and you don't want to go in that situation. But let me just tell you some of the things to look out for. The villa that you own might have what's called a minimum sound abatement necessary to meet. And if you don't meet that requirement, they can come back into you and say, you need to rip out that floor. You need to do it on your own dime. And all that money that you spent on installing that hardwood floor could go basically into the trash.
Okay,
so,
well, in that case, it sounds like you have some experience saying that to people. What would you say are the most common mistakes people are doing when they are the most common reasons you have to tell people that sorry, this floor is not accepted?
A lot of times it's because their flooring installer didn't know what was necessary, and he didn't understand the requirements from the CC&Rs or from the homeowners association, or he didn't understand the requirements from the local government, and he just guessed. He basically just rolled the dice and said, here's what I think might work. And that's the biggest problem that I've seen.
Okay, so I guess it sounds like the one of the big tips we could give for the listeners is that they should make sure to check with the local government, or make sure that they should check with a floor expert on what kind of floor they need for this specific house or that area, in order to make sure that it will be accepted. Because if you're making pretty much any floor that is officially being constructed as a part of a house, if you want to later sell the house, you need to make sure that it's accepted by people like you, right? So it would be good that it would be good that it's accepted by you first.
And accepted by the association. So if you're in a villa and you bought the villa, there's an association and a governing body for that villa typically, and they'll tell you, here's what the minimum requirements are. And that's probably the first bit of advice I would give people, is check to see what the requirements are. And those requirements can come from the villa management. They can come from the governing body in your city or from your country. And you should really try to understand that. Once you do understand that, then bring in a flooring, a sound abatement expert. It's not just necessarily just a flooring expert, because there's a lot of people that know how to mechanically install a floor, but when it comes to sound abatement, it's a specialty. And so people that know how to install floors don't necessarily know about the sound abatement aspects of it.
Yeah, I understand that. It's just, I know that a lot of people who are searching online for how to soundproof their floors, But I also want to know, like, what is the cheaper version of it? Like, if they can go, if they don't want to pull out their like everything from the wall, like they just want to see, like, lay the floor in a cheap way and use cheap materials that still is going to do the job. Are you and that usually means that they want to avoid having to use a lot of consultants if they just want to
Okay.
a lot of square feet. So, what would you advise them?
Let me give you one good bit of advice. It's going to be called kind of like the belt and suspenders advice.
Uh huh.
You know what I'm saying? Being extra cautious. So number one, instead of wood flooring, you actually can locate and source flooring planks that are made out of cork, but they look like wood. And don't get me wrong, I like wood, and I think it's a great product. But when it comes to sound abatement, cork flooring would actually give you a higher resistance to noise. And I would also recommend that you don't glue it down or nail it down, but that you use a floating system. That's number two. And number three, I would recommend that you use a very good quality sound abatement material, and maybe, like I said, two dissimilar materials, both cork and rubber, maybe. And then if you did that in a floating installation, I think that would give you kind of a really great chance to avoid any problems in the future. So if you use all of those tips at the same time, I think you'd be hedging your bet.
Okay. So contacting the local how did you say
Homeowners Association or the governing body in that area.
All right, and use rubber plus cork, preferably if you want to go for the cheap alternative, because cork usually doesn't. It looks very similar to normal wood. I certainly wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So that's that. And is there any other thing? I mean, I've heard.
And then I said, do a floating installation versus a glue down or a nail down installation. So
Right.
A floating installation basically it floats on top of that subfloor material. So that would create less contact and give you better sound abatement characteristics.
Right. Yeah. It's you and you put it together a little bit like a puzzle, right?
Yes, you glue the tongue and the grooves together, but it's not adhering to the substructure.
I get you. All right. Yeah, I've seen that. Okay. What if we go back to the biggest mistakes? Because you've probably seen in 20 years you've seen a lot, probably everything. What are the most common mistakes, except from just guessing which floors you should put there? Over and over again.
One of the things that I see very often is that the flooring material comes in direct contact with the base molding at the wall. So if you look behind you at your wall, down below there's a base molding, and typically the base molding will come into physical contact with the flooring. In sound abatement, it's a big no-no. Think of an electrical current, and you don't want there to be a direct pathway from the flooring to the wall. So there has to be like a little gap in between that.
Really? Why?
Because sound waves, just like electrical waves, move through materials, and they can move from the flooring directly into the base floor, the base material, the base shoe, and the moldings, and then into the wall, and then go below. So that's how sound waves travel.
Oh, right. Okay. Because I talked to another expert, and we were talking about walls, and you should try to cover everything as much as possible, because even if you have a small hole, then doesn't matter how much you've soundproofed your wall. If there's a small hole in your structure, then most of the sound will just go through, and that's why I was surprised about you saying that there should be some space between the wall and the.
No, well, it's between the floor and the wall. So I'm not talking about a hole in the wall. I'm talking about
just
where the floor contacts the wall, that joint area. You don't want the wall to come in contact with the floor. That's what I mean.
I get you. So how much space are we talking about? Just half an inch?
Just maybe an eighth of an inch.
Oh, okay. So that's small. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So not putting the wall and the floor together. Any other things that you've seen that could be really useful to know?
Ooh,
I know I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, but
yeah, it just comes down to how the installation is done. Like I said, another the tip about doing a floating floor installation is good.
Mhm.
Creating an expansion gap or a gap between the flooring and the wall is another good tip. And using dissimilar materials, not just one material. So if you can have two types of materials, one on top of the other, rather than, in other words, if you had a 1/2 inch thick, or let's say, it's probably better to have one material at 2 millimeters and then another material at 2 millimeters than one thick one at 4 millimeters. So you see what I mean? Use two layers instead of one layer.
okay, and those two together can be actually thinner than one material that is thicker than both of them. It'll actually have.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
Interesting.
That's probably a good tip right there.
Interesting, because I heard that it's regarding soundproofing. It's all about weight and density.
Yes, and mass.
Mass, yes. So, but you're saying.
Well, but let me qualify that. It depends on what frequency you're talking about. So the low frequencies are more affected by mass. Mass being like, let's say, a concrete slab. Mass is weight. So the heavier the product, the better it is for low frequencies, like 100 hertz. But the higher frequencies sometimes could be mitigated by cork. And that's why the cork is fairly lightweight. So that's why I'm saying two different type of materials would go after the two different type of frequencies.
All right, could you give me two examples? When you're saying 100 hertz, I don't know what sounds like 100 hertz. Could you give me an example?
A low bass. Let's say, the thumping bass. If you've ever gone to like a nightclub and you can feel the sound in your,
Right.
in your inside, you can hear it. And it's that low thumping bass. Those are low megahertz or low hertz.
All right.
And then if you think of like a piccolo or a flute or something like that, something very high in frequency. Those are the higher frequencies, and you may get low frequencies and high frequencies, but typically low frequencies are the ones that bother people.
So let's say I have one neighbor under me who plays a lot of bass stuff, and I have another neighbor right under me that plays the violin, very high frequency stuff. What kind of floors would you recommend specifically for those two cases, assuming that we're not ignoring a lot of the surrounding problems, like what kind of house it is and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, if you didn't know what kind of frequencies you were going to be exposed to, you can have mass, which is the cork. I'm sorry, which is the rubber, and the rubber is very heavy as opposed to cork. And then if you wanted to have 3 millimeters of rubber and 2 millimeters of cork, something like that might work well. Because it would give you, both. It would give you exposure to both protections, both low frequencies and higher frequencies as well.
I get you. You've mentioned
in the same structure.
Okay, so you've mentioned those two a lot, cork and rubber. Is there are those, would you say, the go-to materials regarding soundproofing?
Not necessarily. There is one called a spun plastic, and basically it's an air gap material, and basically that just gives you what that gives you is it avoids the transmission of some of those low frequencies. There's not a lot of mass to it, but it does give you some sort of sound abatement characteristics because the vibration is not transmitted through. So it'll cut some of the low frequencies to some degree. So there is that material. It's just a sound mat. And when you hear about sound mat, sometimes that's what they're talking about is kind of a sound abatement mat that is designed to cut off low frequencies. But again, a lot of their technical data will come back and tell you what frequencies it works best with. So this is really where you need to kind of open up the laboratory report and look at that a little bit. And in my practice, what I do is I work in conjunction with a sound engineer, and I let him look at it. So it's kind of like you send it to a laboratory, and you get their expert opinion, and that's really where the expertise comes into when you seek the help of real scientists that can look at the numbers. So normally, what I'm involved with is the actual in the field type of sound abatement materials. And then I work in conjunction with a laboratory, and that typically gives us the best and the highest amount of sound abatement technology and expertise, because it's not just myself. I'm working with a laboratory as well.
I get you. So I'm just going through my head what are the most normal questions that a lot of people want to know. And I know that a lot of people want to soundproof their living room and also their bedroom. And if there are two types of sounds, as you know, there is the echoing sound and then the structural sound. I think they might have like different terminologies, but let's say that you have a child that is jumping from the sofa down to the floor, or two children, they're playing around, and which means they're jumping around a lot, and they're making that sound, the heavy sound that makes a structural sound. I'm wondering, what do heavy and thick mats help, or is there anything else that you would recommend in order to soundproof a living floor?
And then you're protecting the people below you, correct?
Yes. Well, assuming
Okay.
it's the same house, or you just want to make sure that it's as quiet as possible. That's not going to disturb anyone.
So you could attack this in multiple ways. Obviously, mass will again protect against the low frequencies, and jumping down heavy creates a lot of low frequency thumping. That's a low frequency. Typically, the structure of your home, you don't have much you can do with that, because the home's already been built. So you're basically retrofitting an existing home. And what you could do is mitigate some of that vibration by that sound abatement mat, and also by doing a floating floor that also decouple, and that's probably a good word. You want to decouple the floor away from the substructure. Do you know what I mean by decouple?
Never heard it before.
Decouple is separating. You want to separate out the floor from the subfloor. And you do that by putting in a sound abatement mat, or by putting in a cord that'll decouple it. The rubber mat will actually create mass, and that'll also help in decreasing the amount of sound abatement. So those are the things that you could look at, is decoupling the floor away from the subfloor.
Okay, and it also sounds like if you're trying to use like soft materials, I'm assuming that it has to. The softer the material, obviously it's going to be harder to walk on it, but it will definitely absorb some of the sound with all of the jumping and so on would do, right?
Yeah, and that's where you use the mesh mat. The mat will there's an air gap in there, and basically it's a softer material that will give some amount of play in it. So there's a lot of different techniques that are used to go after sound abatement and to mitigate the sound. Some of them involve just heavy mass. So that rubber is a heavy mass material. So is concrete, by the way. And so in the building that you're in right now, one of the reasons that you're not hearing the people above you is there's probably either 6 or 8 inches of concrete above your head. Think about that.
I know it's an example, but I hear from. I don't hear anything from my neighbors, and I know that this is everything here. This is a very typical build. You see, there was a housing crisis in the 80s, and here in Sweden, and we built a lot of concrete buildings by then, like mass-produced. And so even though I'm like in a I would say like middle-class area, it's still, we try to mass-produce a lot of buildings at in a quick rate. And so we have these really robust concrete buildings.
So your neighbor to the left and right of you, between you and those neighbors, the wall is made out of concrete?
Yes.
Oh, so that's unusual.
I just want to. Yeah, maybe you can hear. It's definitely concrete.
Okay, so that is not the norm in the United States. If you were to do that in the United States, no, you would have a hollow wall there.
Well, this one is not concrete. This is.
Okay.
Yeah, but.
Is that your bedroom?
No, there's just. It's a kitchen on the other side.
Your kitchen?
Yeah. So.
Okay, so you see what they're doing there is they're separating you from your neighbors with concrete, but you from yourself is just drywall.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
So at least in your country, they gave it some thought. The problem is not every country deals with their population the same way, and that's unfortunate because somebody who in Los Angeles might be buying a condominium, they're not going to have the same amount of luxury that you have.
Yeah, it's. Like we have just German and Swedish and Nordic architecture is it's extremely practical, which also it damages the aesthetical part, but they are sure practical. Let's put it that way.
I'm shrugging my shoulders right now because, quite frankly, we can't all of a sudden just change the way that we do things here in the United States, which is completely different. I mean, every country is different, and so what we're doing here is different. The problem is that the same requirements that you would like to have in your country, and you do have in your country, we don't necessarily have right off the bat here in the United States. And I think that goes to your blog and your what you're trying to create right now, which is information for people, which is how do they get the Nordic standard in Los Angeles? In other words, if you want to be driving a Volvo or a Saab, and we're making Fords here in the United States, obviously you see I'm giving you the analogy. You want to drive a Saab, you want to drive a Volvo, but instead we're producing a Ford. You see the analogy there?
Yeah. We just want our stuff to work. It doesn't have to be.
Well, look at the cars that we created. Look at the cars you created. It's different.
Well, you got the Hummers, and that's I think that's the most American car I've seen in my life.
Yeah, but it's also only gets 12 miles to the gallon. So how practical it is, that's another situation.
Well, we buy.
And that's a military vehicle too. So
is it? I just thought it was look how big my car is thing. Right? I didn't.
No, that Hummer was taken from the Humvee, which is the United States military Jeep, basically a Jeep replacement. So think about the World War II Jeep. That was the vehicle that basically replaced the U.S. Jeep.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
Okay, so
I thought it was just designed for bodybuilders or
something. For Arnold Schwarzenegger, yeah, he was one of the first people that drove that. No, it's actually a U.S. military vehicle. But getting back to the situation of what we're talking about here is what you deal with in your country is different than what we're dealing with in the United States, and also in different parts of the United States. So I'm located here in Los Angeles, and sometimes depending upon what year the building was made, especially buildings in the United States, what we had is a lot of buildings were constructed in the 80s, like your country, but what they did was they built a lot of apartments, and the sound abatement that they were willing to do for people in apartments was almost non-existent. But 20 or 30 years later, they converted those apartments to condominiums. And if you could imagine, you moved into an apartment, and if the sound was too much, you moved out and bought yourself a home. But let's say 20 years later, you bought that same apartment, except now the name is not apartment, it's a home or a condo, and you own it. What are you going to do? You own that. You can't simply just move out easily. You have to sell the unit.
Mm.
And so now you're taking basically what was an apartment and living in it as if it is a home. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess the whole people think a little bit, even the real estate situation and the way the people are thinking here in Sweden is a little bit different regarding how you should invest and into homes and what it means to have a good living. Like, but it is what it is.
Yeah, well, what I'm getting to is that this is what a lot of people in Los Angeles and California are facing, which is they're in environments that are basically, from what I've heard, unlivable, where they can't enjoy their homes. And it's affecting their ability to sleep and focus. And it really, after a while, it gets to them. You know, it's that constant sound is getting to them. So
Yeah,
it's
actually,
affecting their health.
surprisingly many in my country know a lot about Los Angeles because, well, that's where we get, the information because we are very much left. Like, for you, the absolute left wing that you guys have, like, I don't know, Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders and so on, that's just centrist. That's just a normal politician here. Right? We're just, when he's talking about free healthcare and like, I don't know, universal basic income, we're just like, what's the big deal? We don't get it.
Yeah.
So the point is that our picture of we think that everyone in the United States comes from LA and everybody is acting because that's the only source that we don't even know what Fox News is. We just know about CNN and that's it.
Wow.
So the point is that we actually the situation in LA, that's actually something that a lot of people know about, from here. That because for better or worse, that's pretty much why we get a good understanding of LA people, but everyone else we have no idea what's going on in the center anywhere else. But that's a funny anecdote. I have a question about. So we just talked about if children are jumping off of a sofa, and if there are sounds in the bedroom, and if something is for heavier sound. But let's say that I have somebody who plays violin under me, and I think you've mentioned cork. You've mentioned lighter materials that are better at bouncing off echo. But is there anything in particular that you think usually works really well for that particular high frequency sound?
And this is from unit to unit, not within your unit, right? From the downstairs unit to your unit up above, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just sick of that sound. I want to somehow get rid of it. What do I do?
So those are higher frequencies,
Yeah.
and cork would probably work well with something like that. That probably would be a good solution for you. I don't know if I have a silver bullet that could immediately resolve all the issues.
I get you.
And a lot of it would have to do with some amount of sound abatement testing, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know if I have a straight answer for you on that one.
No, well, but generally it sounds like lighter materials that are a little bit more dense, right? And
well, lighter materials and dense are kind of polar opposites. But
oh, sorry,
cork, yeah, cork is a lighter material and it's not that dense, but it does have sound abatement characteristics that work. Cork has always been used to absorb. So there's different ways that you want to prevent the sound from going through. Absorption is one, and then the mass would just absorb it as well, which is the concrete. So cork absorbs a certain type of sound waves, and so does concrete. Which waves or sound waves absorbs which waves more or less is a science in and of itself.
I get you. All right.
And so I guess it goes to there's not one single, and this is why maybe trying to get some sort of a sound abatement expert to help you with that, because your needs might be different than anybody else's needs based upon your building.
Mm.
And what type of sound waves you're trying to mitigate. Does that make sense?
It does, and there's the problem because it's because I'm looking for specific advice, but again, I understand that it really depends on the acoustics in general and the structure of a home. Especially when you gave me in the beginning of the interview, you told me that there was one house that you saw that had pretty much nothing between the two layers of the floor, and the sound was just bouncing around. And if you give me one of your tips right now, then that tip would not perhaps work on the example you just said in the beginning of the interview. So a lot of floors have different characteristics, which means you have to apply the different methods to them. I see that, and I see the difficulty, and that's why one of your best tips would probably be that you need to consult with a lot of people who have already had similar floors and ask how they did it, right?
Oh, that's a very good point. Is like in your building, somebody might have already installed hardwood floors, and they may have used a certain type of material. And certainly there you have a real life example of how it worked or how it didn't work. So this might tell you what not to use. And so that might be a good idea, is if you could just, somehow find out what was used in your building so far. So maybe that's a good suggestion and a good recommendation right off the bat right there.
Go to your neighbors, ask them. Yeah.
Or go to the building management. They might know. A lot of times when a building owner or an apartment owner is trying to put sound abatement material in, he'll go to the development management and he'll make a request to be allowed to install that material. And perhaps they either know what was used, or they could refer you to the actual unit owner, and you can go into him and say, hey, you know what, I'm thinking of doing the same thing in my unit. Could you give me some advice, or tell me what you used and tell me if it worked or not? And you might even want to go to the person below and ask him, how well the material works, although that may be stirring the pot a little bit, but that might be something that you could do.
I get you. Is there anything else that you feel that anybody who wants to build like their own floor in soundproof, is there anything you feel like you haven't said that is important that you mentioned?
I think we've covered pretty much everything at this point. I don't know if there's anything else I could add to it. I could probably answer a direct question if you had it, but I can't think of anything that I haven't really covered in this conversation.
In that case, they can. If there's anything else, I'll ask you and I'll add it to the blog post.
Sure, absolutely.
Well, Jeff, could you tell me where, if people are interested in finding out more, they need this expert in order to check their floor, where can they go to find you?
So what was the question?
Well, where can they find you? What's your website, and if they want to get...
Oh, my website, yeah. Yes. My website is flooringdetective.com.
Mm-hmm.
Flooringdetective.com. And www.flooringdetective.com. I have a website there. You could send an email to me. And they could send out requests, and I would try to help them with whatever they're working with at that point.
Great. Are you only in LA, or do you work in San Francisco, or?
Well, I mean, virtually I can work anywhere in the world, quite frankly.
As a consultant,
As a consultant. And at that point, I might be able to help them identify somebody locally if they needed to actually do field testing. I'm a member of the National Wood Floor Association, and they have some information as well, which is nwfa.org. And, I potentially could help them with whatever questions that they have, or at least send them in the right direction, perhaps. That maybe is what I would be able to do, is kind of help them to figure out what their next steps are, perhaps.
And that's about it for how to soundproof a floor. Thank you for watching. I promise that the upcoming videos will have better audio and video quality. This was my very first YouTube video. But thank you for sticking around. Feel free to subscribe and like if you want me to interview more soundproofing experts. And until next time, take care.